Hello and welcome back to my Silent Hill review marathon, where we're finally taking a look at the third game released in the series with Silent Hill 3 for the PS2. Now, despite me having previous knowledge about Silent Hill 1 and 2 before playing them for my reviews, I actually know absolutely nothing about the third and fourth entries in the series. I kind of feel like people don't like talking about these ones quite as much as they do with the first two, and I'm wondering if there's a reason for that. So, let's dive into it. Silent Hill 3 opens with another one of those introduction cinematics that consist of a montage of cutscenes found throughout the game. I know I've complained about this before for the previous games, but I really do kinda feel like these are a bit pointless. I would rather the game just open straight to the title screen, because showing us all of these out of context cutscenes with some questionable music layered on top really doesn't do anything for me. And the argument could be made that these scenes are kinda spoilery. Getting past that though, just like with Silent Hill 2, we have some interesting difficulty settings where we can adjust the puzzles separately to the combat, which is awesome that this is now a tradition of the games because it makes them much more accessible for people who maybe haven't played a lot of games like this, or people that are looking for challenging riddles but easy combat, or vice versa. As per usual though, I just went with the normal setting for both of these because I feel like that's probably the intended way of playing it. Unlike the previous two games, Silent Hill 3 kinda just throws us straight in at the deep end. There's not much of an introduction at all here, and after a short cinematic showing this twitching guy, we start playing in this weird abandoned amusement park as a new character to the series called Heather. The way that monster was twitching in the introduction sequence really reminds me of something, but I can't for the life of me remember what— Oh god! The first area of the game is actually pretty darn chaotic, and I almost think that the game is assuming that you've already played at least one of the older games in the series, because it feels like if this was your first one, you'd be a little bit overwhelmed. It's really dark and difficult to see where you're going, there's tons of enemies around every corner that are desperate to rip your head off, and the layout of the area is pretty maze-like too. Luckily it's quite linear, so it's kind of easy to just stumble your way forward, but yeah, this introduction sequence is very different to the slow-paced and atmospheric introductions found in the previous games. This one is very fast-paced and almost like a chase sequence, so it's nice to see them going for something different this time around. This section ends with Heather being hit by a roller coaster after she starts running down the tracks to evade her pursuers, but of course, it was all a dream, and she wakes up in a cafe inside of a mall. She calls her dad on a nearby payphone and lets him know she's okay before deciding to go home. But while making her way through the mall, she's being followed by a private investigator whose name is Douglas. Before being able to properly explain to Heather what he's doing there, she very smartly walks away from him, finding him to be a bit creepy and a little bit stalkerish. It's at this point though where the mall suddenly starts to transform, and it's clear that the other world that's normally contained within Silent Hill is taking over the mall. This is weird because Heather isn't in Silent Hill at this point, so something bad is clearly going on. And so the transformed mall turns into the first proper area of the game. So you find a map, you get new weapons, you come across loads of locked doors, and you encounter a ton of horrific enemies. It's just your standard trip out, really. Something that's much better about this game than the previous one is that there's a ton of variety with the enemy designs here, and they also all have different attacks to be aware of, which make them stand out from a gameplay perspective too. Silent Hill 2 had very little variety in enemies, and even when there was something new visually, it was still beaten in the exact same way gameplay-wise. By the end of the game, the combat kind of became monotonous, which was a shame considering that a fairly large portion of the gameplay is based around combat. In Silent Hill 3, you can tell they were trying to rectify this particular issue too, because while the gun combat is exactly the same as usual, the melee combat has been made much more interesting. You can now block enemy attacks by timing a button press while readying your weapon, which nullifies any damage but can leave you open to attack if done incorrectly. And you also have a new lunge attack with certain weapons, which hits enemies from much more of a distance but doesn't do as much damage as a strong attack would. The strong attack itself is also no longer activated depending on how much pressure you put on the X button, but rather it goes back to how it worked in Silent Hill 1, and simply holding the button activates the strong attack, which I prefer. There's also significantly less ammo to be found in the levels too, so it seems like they really wanted you to prioritise the melee weapons this time around, which is awesome because it feels like you're scavenging and making use of what you find, rather than being a powerhouse like you were in Silent Hill 2. But the focus on melee weapons isn't the only way that Silent Hill 3 mixes up the formula a bit, because there's actually something quite a lot more interesting to talk about here, and that's the level design and the general structure that the game uses. So in both Silent Hill 1 and 2, the way progression worked is that you started in an open area and were free to explore the streets and find optional items before reaching a particular building, which starts the next proper level of the game. In Silent Hill 3 though, there's no open areas to explore, and rather, the game entirely consists of the smaller levels, and you automatically get taken to the next area after completing each level. Don't get me wrong, this is done organically, and it's not like it pops up on the screen saying level 1 complete or anything like that, but this is a very strange difference to the previous games. I was saying in the last reviews that I really liked the idea of the open areas, but I feel like they were underutilised by not allowing you to go into many optional buildings or complete many side quests or anything like that. But now, with Silent Hill 3, rather than adding more content to the open areas, they opted instead to cut them out of the game completely. Which, to be fair, does solve the issue, but I can imagine a lot of people would be put off of this, because after all, these open areas where you explore the foggy town of Silent Hill are where it gets a lot of its atmosphere from. Another key difference with the level design is that it seemed to me that it was far more linear than the other games. In Silent Hill 1 and 2, it felt like you needed to backtrack to earlier sections of the levels quite a lot in order to unlock new places to go to fully explore everywhere, and stuff like that. In Silent Hill 1 especially, you basically had to do each level twice, once for the normal version and then once again for the Otherworld version, and this made each area feel really fleshed out and memorable. So the issue with Silent Hill 3 is that because the areas are more linear and don't feature much backtracking, the level designs feel far less memorable. But another issue is that because you know you won't be coming back to most of these areas, you don't feel like you need to kill any enemies because it's more easy to just run past them, and it's more efficient to do that too, so you aren't using up any of your resources like ammo or healing items. I swear that 90% of the enemies in this game are just quickly bypassed, whereas in Silent Hill 1 and 2, I killed almost everything I came across. You could argue that this is a good thing, because it makes it more scary to run away from everything, but I think that's just the thing with this. Whether you prefer the style of Silent Hill 1 and 2, or the new style of 3, is entirely subjective, and both ways have the pros and cons. The absolute biggest pro of this new structure though is that because each level is finished quicker than before due to the removal of backtracking, there's also far more areas to explore to compensate for this, and some of these are really good. We've already briefly talked about the amusement park and the mall, but there's also a moving train that you need to get to the front of, a sewer, a decrepit office building where loads of different businesses used to work, a church, and, of course, a hospital. Seriously, I'm getting a bit sick of these hospitals making an appearance in these games now. So far, there's been a hospital in every single entry. And this isn't just any old hospital either. This is the exact same hospital that we went to in Silent Hill 2. So not only are they reusing a level theme for the third time, but it goes as far as to reuse the exact same level design too. In all fairness, this area has obviously been restructured and features different puzzles and a completely different way to progress through it, but still, why? I mean, for God's sake, we even have zombie nurses as enemies again. Sure, they're slightly different to the past two renditions, but at the end of the day, they're still zombie nurses. Only this time, they're packing heat, baby! I really hope Silent Hill 4 doesn't use a hospital as one of its main locations, although maybe I am making too much of a big deal out of this because every other location in Silent Hill 3 stands out from the ones that we've seen previously, especially because some of them aren't actually set in Silent Hill itself, so it makes them more interesting to explore and to work out what's going on. One thing's for sure though, these monster designs are potentially the best we've ever seen in the series so far. I absolutely hated coming across these big monsters here because not only do they tank damage like crazy, but they can also take you by surprise because they're always lying down on the floor to begin with and look dead. Plus, they're also extremely fast and chase you if you try to run away from them. There's loads of other monsters too, but these ones were probably the ones that got under my skin the most. I also found these tall guys that look like they're on stilts or something pretty freaky looking. There's never been anything this tall in the games before, so when I saw them for the first time, it caught me off guard. It's great, and like I said earlier, there's far more monsters in this game than in the second one, which kept me on my toes for the whole thing. Just like the two previous games, Silent Hill 3 features a ton of spooky moments that are designed to mess with you, and potentially features some of the best moments that we've seen in the entire series so far. Although, I would probably say that Silent Hill 1 still has this game beat in this area. One of the most iconic moments in the game is this bit where you enter a bathroom within an Otherworld section and the door locks behind you. So you're just left in this huge room with a mirror spread across an entire wall, and you watch as everything around you is slowly overcome with darkness which appears to be bubbling from a nearby sink. It's quite panic-inducing, and I have to admit that the first time I did this section, I didn't know how to escape it, and I actually died after the darkness consumed me. I figured you had to smash the mirror or something, but the solution is actually a lot simpler than that. You literally just have to walk out of the door because it automatically unlocks after a while. There's tons of other moments like this that people don't tend to bring up in videos about it though. Like this bit where you enter a mannequin shop and go into a storeroom, and Heather remarks on how the mannequins are making her nervous. But you press forward to find an item, but as soon as you pick it up, you hear this. So, of course, you investigate the noise, only to find that a nearby mannequin's head has fallen off, and there's blood everywhere. I kind of expected this to turn into an enemy, but nothing happens with it. You just leave, and it's never mentioned again. There's also a bit really early on in the game where you knock on a bathroom stall door and someone knocks back, then later on you do it again once the place has been overrun by monsters, and someone is still in there knocking on the other side. So you open the door, and no one's there. It's spooky stuff. I don't know what it is with this series and having spooky moments like this set within bathrooms, but so far every single game has done this. I think horror media in general has a fascination with bathrooms, maybe because they're so confined and because there's normally only a single exit door. But the best spooky moment in the game for me was this entire part where you go through a haunted house ride at the amusement park, and the ride itself seems to be messing with you. There's a recording of a narrator that talks you through the attraction, but it seems oddly threatening towards you and makes you question if the things in the house are real. Heather even remarks at one point that the blood effects smell like real blood. It's rare that the Silent Hill games use actual jump scares, but this haunted house actually has one because obviously it's an amusement park attraction, so it makes sense.
That's Danny.
But it actually caught me a bit off guard because I'm so used to the games not doing that sort of thing. This section ends with Heather having to run down a series of hallways that start blocking her off and folding in on themselves, and I've always found the idea of this pretty freaky. This is an idea that was later greatly expanded in PT, so it's interesting that the Silent Hill series had done this sort of thing before. Looking back on it, if I would have played these games before playing PT, I think it would have been fairly obvious that that was a Silent Hill game. There's just way too many similarities with things like the twitching ghost, the radio messing with you, the looping hallways, the fact that you find a torch item, and just the general vibe the game gives off. There's loads of spooky moments like these that I've not even talked about as well, because I don't want to ruin absolutely everything the game has to offer. So, while the actual level layouts might not be as memorable as in previous games, I feel like it sort of gets away with that because the individual spooky moments are so memorable. After the incredibly dark tone that Silent Hill 2 went for, you might be thinking that the third game would take this even further and be the bleakest game in the series yet. But actually, this is potentially the most light-hearted game so far, and I think a lot of this comes down to Heather being a much more positive character and the game's bizarre sense of humour. There's a moment early in the game where there's a clogged toilet, and the implication is that there's a key item inside of it. This in itself is a reference to Silent Hill 2, where James shoves his hand into a toilet with no hesitation and doesn't even wash his hands afterwards, or seem to care about the event in the slightest. So Heather goes to do the same thing, but then stops herself and pretty much directly speaks to the player, saying, "Forget it, this is way too gross," as if she's mocking the character from the last game. Then there's a moment where you find a ringing phone hidden in a locker, and the person on the other end of the phone starts singing happy birthday to you, but has forgotten your name. So they ask what your name is, but Heather responds by asking, "Who are you?" And the person on the other end thanks her and continues the song thinking that your name is "Who are you?" It's almost like this situation is so weird and funny that it almost becomes creepier because of the context of it all, but it's still got a chuckle out of me. There's also a bit later on where the detective from the start of the game is hurt, and Heather approaches him pretending that she's gone insane and is gonna kill him, and it's just so inappropriate given the situation. It's ridiculous, and the game actually has quite a few moments like this that break up the constant scares. Despite it being a little bit weird that this game uses elements of comedy like this, I did actually like it, and I found that it reminded me a lot of the TV show Twin Peaks, which famously is an inspiration of Silent Hill, so I wouldn't be surprised if this was done on purpose. One of the other things I thought Silent Hill 3 did better than any other game so far is the way that we get to learn a lot more about the main character's thoughts and feelings, and by the end of the game, you feel like you've really connected to her. She's far more relatable than the previous characters, with her being a normal teenager, something which we've all been at one point in our lives. Whereas, not all of us are parents like Harry from the first game, and not all of us have lost as much as James from the second game. Heather also acts way more realistically to things going on around her. Like I said way earlier, she walks away from the detective at the start of the game because he's acting suspiciously, and knows she shouldn't be going along with people she doesn't know, and she isn't afraid to call characters out on the suspicious and erratic behaviour either. While I feel like Harry, and especially James, would have just have gone along with it. The bits of flavour text we get when interacting with different objects in the world is amazing too. It acts as a sort of inner monologue, so we get to hear Heather's thoughts about particular things. For example, there's a bit where you come across a pack of cigarettes, and she says that she doesn't want one because she stopped smoking recently, which makes us connect with her a bit more because we're getting to know more about her past, and therefore her personality, outside of all of this horror. From this we can get the impression that maybe she's a little bit rebellious, after all she is only 17, but it also shows us that she does have morals, because after all she did choose to stop smoking, and doesn't want one even in this situation. One of the best bits of flavour text though is here where I interacted with this doll and she clearly had positive feelings towards it, pointing out that it reminds her of her dolls when she was a kid. But then you read a note that's been placed next to it and you find out that the doll has been left there by some kind of stalker who is referring to her by name. And when inspecting the doll after reading this, she acts disgusted by it and doesn't want to go anywhere near it. This flavour text is also used to great effect as foreshadowing, where at the start of the game you learn that Heather doesn't like mirrors and might have a phobia of them when you interact with one in a bathroom. Then later you go to Heather's apartment and you find that her mirrors have all been covered up, and these details culminate in the section we previously talked about in the mirror room where a fear comes to life and a reflection is seemingly possessed. I've never known a game to utilise flavour text this effectively and combine it so well with the actual story, and with elements of environmental storytelling as well. It's amazing, and it's something that I'd like to see more games try to do. So we've talked about combat and we've talked about exploration, but now we need to talk about the third strand of gameplay found within the Silent Hill games, and that's the puzzles. I'm a bit conflicted on this, to be honest, because for the first half of the game, there's practically no proper puzzles at all. There's this one where you need to put books back on a shelf to reveal a combination for a door that's been scratched onto the spines, but this is about it. I do want to give this game credit in this area though, because the way that you put the books onto the shelf is done by simply dragging and dropping them into place, and it's really easy to rearrange them and move them wherever you want. The reason I bring this up is because there was a puzzle like this in Silent Hill 2, and the user interface literally ruined the entire thing. You couldn't see where you was placing objects before putting them in, and you had to go through loads of menus and text to reposition things, and it was just a total mess. So it's really good that they improved this in the third game. But anyway, instead of having straight up puzzles, for most of the game, this has been replaced by simply finding and using key items in a specific way to progress forward. So you'll find a coat hanger which is used to reach and pull down a ladder, you'll use a wine bottle and fill it with oil to use as fuel to make a hoist work, and loads of things like that. This is fine, and the other games did this as well, and I did enjoy using the items in inventive ways like this, but it isn't until you're about halfway through the game that you get some serious puzzle action. When it finally does happen though, the puzzles here are actually really good. Some of these are easily just as good as the puzzles from the first game, but the first game was just a lot more consistent with how it spread its puzzles out, so I would argue that the first game is better in this area. One of my favourite puzzles in the third game though is this one where you find a riddle which you need to solve to open a combination locked door. This took me way longer than I would like to admit, but when I figured it out, it felt amazing. And that's the sign of a good puzzle in my eyes. It needs to be difficult enough to have you writing things down and scratching your head, but not so difficult that you're forced to look up the solution. And when Silent Hill 3 finally gets going with the puzzles, it consistently has this effect. It's just a shame that it takes so long to actually come across them. And now we get to the point of the video where I want to talk about the game's story. So, you can either plug your ears, shut your eyes and scream for a few minutes, or you can click the time displayed on the screen now to avoid any spoilers. Let's go. So it turns out that Silent Hill 3 is actually a direct sequel to the first game, which is weird because Silent Hill 2 seemingly attempted to make the series into a sort of anthology, where each game is self-contained but shares the same setting. I liked that a lot and kinda wish it would have kept going with that idea, but now we have a much more conventional sequel. I feel like this is an example of a sequel where in order to properly understand what's happening, you have to have played the first game, because while it is explained what happened in Silent Hill 1, you aren't really given a full breakdown, so I feel like you could end up a bit lost. Luckily for us though, we have played the first game, so it was pretty easy to follow. So Heather, it turns out, is the baby that Harry escaped Silent Hill with at the end of the first game and is basically become her foster father. They've led normal lives for 17 years, but all of a sudden Heather is now being followed by both a man named Douglas, who is the detective, and a weird woman called Claudia, who is spouting a load of nonsense about finding paradise and remembering who you are. The mall that Heather's in is taken over by the Otherworld, which was a constant thing that happened to Harry during the first game, where the world suddenly shifts into a dark version of itself, where monsters roam and everything is rusty and covered in blood. But she eventually escapes this dark version of the mall after defeating a boss that looks like a big worm with a human mouth. Seeing as we're in the spoiler section of the video here, I just want to quickly go on a tangent and say that the boss battles in this game are easily the best we've seen in the series so far. During the fight with this worm, you have to keep an eye on which tunnel it's coming from and then shoot it when its mouth is unprotected. But the best boss in the game is probably the second one, where you fight this humanoid looking creature that runs around really fast and has a couple of blades it holds in its hands. Because it's so fast, it's difficult to keep track of where it is, and it has a habit of running off into the darkness and then trying to flank you. And not only that, but it uses its blades to defend itself from gunshots and melee hits. So the best strategy I found was to use a melee weapon and hit it just when it starts its attack animation. Then, because it's already started this animation, it can't block quickly enough and you can get the upper hand. This is a great fight and the best boss in the entire game. And while some of the other bosses later on are pretty good too, none of them come close to this fight. So it's good to see the third game improve in this area too. Anyway, to cut a long story short here, Heather basically slowly makes her way back home where she thinks safety will be. But to do that, she needs to go through not only the mall, but a subway station, a train ride, and go through an old office building. All while constantly dipping in and out of the other world, which is somehow appearing outside of Silent Hill. Heather finally reaches her apartment where she expects to reunite with Harry, her father, and the protagonist of the first game. I mean, if anyone would know what to do in this situation, it would be him, right? But unfortunately, upon reaching Heather's apartment, we find Harry sat there dead. Whoa, I literally didn't see that coming. They actually canonically killed one of the main characters of the entire series. And not just any main character, but the main protagonist of the very first game. That's a bold move. I honestly expected that Harry and Heather would go to Silent Hill together later in the game or something. But no, shocking stuff. Heather finds out that Claudia, the strange woman from earlier, had Harry killed by a monster so that it would make Heather angry and awaken her true self. This doesn't really work though, and Heather ends up killing the monster while Claudia escapes, telling Heather to go to Silent Hill. Douglas, the detective from earlier, arrives on the scene and finds Harry's dead body, and they hold a funeral for him. Douglas offers his help to get Heather to Silent Hill and find out what's going on, and it turns out that he was hired by Claudia to track Heather down, under the impression that Heather had been kidnapped. So he obviously feels guilty for being partly responsible for everything that's happening. On the car journey to Silent Hill, Heather basically summarises the story of the first game to Douglas, and he becomes a sort of parental figure for the remainder of the game after the two bond. Back in my review of the first game, I probably didn't even need to do a massive plot summary section at the end, because I could have just shown you this cutscene instead. Seriously, the amount of context that just suddenly gets dumped on you sounds insane if you've not already played the first game. I'm gonna be honest, a lot of the events that happen once you reach Silent Hill could be considered filler, and while it is pretty interesting and expands the lore of the game a lot and answers some questions that were left open in the first game, I won't go into too much detail here just because I want the video to be reasonably short. One thing I will say though is that I found it really cool how once you get to Silent Hill, you're actually in the exact same area that you were in Silent Hill 2. Douglas even mentions that he went on a missing persons case in this area a few years ago, which I take to be a heavy implication that this missing person was James from the second game. But Douglas says that he was never found. Maybe that's because he's at the bottom of the lake, or maybe it's that he's simply in hiding, depending on the ending you got in the second game. But anyway, while it is really cool seeing some familiar locations from a brand new perspective, it's such a shame that most areas here are sealed off. You can't go into the bowling alley, and you're stopped from going too far down the road to the apartment building, and you can't get to the Historical Society either. It would have been so awesome to have gone into the Historical Society and it just be a normal museum rather than the hellscape it was in the second game. But unfortunately, they didn't do this. You can visit the nightclub from the second game though, and it's funny because Heather comments on it being dingy, whereas James seemed to think that it wasn't too bad. There's a flyer here on the floor which talks about the return of Lady Maria as well, which is clearly a reference to Maria from the second game. Oddly, these exterior sections of Silent Hill, despite being linear due to all of the blocked paths, actually made the game start chugging a lot. It was dropping frames all over the place, and it was actually pretty distracting. Clearly this game was made in such a way that it could only handle loading in small areas at a time, and when it tries to do these more open, foggy sections, it just can't do it. So that's weird because none of the other games have ever struggled in this way at all. But anyway, back to the story. To cut it fairly short, Heather eventually makes her way to a church, all while battling her inner demons as she slowly remembers who she actually is, and that she's basically a reincarnated version of Alessa, the girl in the first game who was chosen to give birth to God, but failed, and it resulted in her suffering immense pain for years, which caused the town of Silent Hill to become the cursed entity that it currently is. So with this knowledge, Heather eventually tracks down Claudia and is made aware that she's still impregnated with the godlike entity that Claudia and her religion worships. So the idea here is that Claudia wanted Heather to be filled with hatred, which in turn would make Heather start having contractions and give birth. During the game's climax, this finally actually starts happening, but luckily Heather was given a pendant from Harry which contained a small amount of the red liquid that Dr. Kaufman used to weaken the god in the first game. So using a bit of quick thinking, she eats the now hardened red liquid and then vomits up a fetus, which prevents the god from being born properly. So now we have yet another similarity to PT with a fetus. But the fetus in this game doesn't talk, unfortunately. Claudia then stops Heather just as she's about to stamp on the fetus and put an end to it, and she swallows it, therefore becoming the surrogate mother of God and seemingly giving birth to it properly before Heather defeats it in the final boss fight. She then escapes the church and reunites with Douglas, who was injured earlier, and the two of them escape Silent Hill. The final image in the credits shows Heather visiting Harry's grave, letting us know he did receive a proper burial and presumably a funeral. Heather now also decides to go by what she sees as her true name, which is Cheryl, named after Harry's daughter who went missing in the original game. She seemingly adopts this name as a way of her choosing her own destiny, rather than the one determined for her by Claudia and the religion she's a part of, and also as a way of honouring her father's death. For once in the series, we know for certain that this specific ending is the canon one as well, because not only is it the only ending you can get on a first playthrough, but the events featured in the other endings are contradicted by Silent Hill Homecoming, where you can apparently find a note which details how Douglas exposed the cult after the events of Silent Hill 3. And seeing as Douglas dies in one of the other endings, and the third ending is a parody UFO ending, this means we actually have a concrete canon ending for once. Although, I guess you could argue that Silent Hill Homecoming might not be truly canon due to it not being developed by the original creators, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Overall, the story here is alright. I find that Heather as a character and the way she reacts and impacts the story is better than the actual plot, if that makes any sense. Just like Silent Hill 1, I don't really like the fact that the game becomes all about a cult. That just isn't very scary to me, and it kinda gives us too many answers as to why Silent Hill is cursed, rather than just leaving it open to interpretation. It also causes a bit of an issue with plot consistency, because in Silent Hill 2 the implication is that people are called there who have sinned or that are looking for some sort of redemption. And that would mean that all of the monsters and imagery are references to the subconscious. But then in Silent Hill 1 and 3, the reason for all of the monsters and strange occurrences is just that a god and a cult of worshippers is behind it. But what does that have to do with the events of Silent Hill 2 then? It just feels a little bit messy, to be honest, and it's probably best to just not read too much into it. Speaking of the imagery within Silent Hill 2 though, while there obviously is symbolism used in the third game, it's nowhere near as interesting, and I think this is due to the fact that maybe Heather just isn't as flawed of a character as James was. With James's sanity constantly being questioned, it kind of made the second game more psychological as we explored things relating to his desires and his guilt. But Heather doesn't really have any guilt, and she appears to be perfectly sane and hasn't committed any huge sin or anything. So it's this double-edged sword situation. With her being much more of a normal person, it makes her more relatable, but because she is so much of a normal person, the game's story isn't quite as good as it was in the second game. So yeah, while I don't think the story in Silent Hill 3 comes close to the story that was featured in the second game, it is still good in its own right, and the character of Heather being so likeable and relatable really pushes the action forward. And I just want to say as well that normally when I'm doing a video like this, after I finish the script, I watch a couple of other reviews out there just to get a feel of what the general opinion of the game is. And while I was doing that, I came across a video called The Real Horror of Silent Hill 3 by EuroThug4000, who goes into a deep analysis of the game based on her experiences as a woman, and it actually made me appreciate the game a lot more. There's a lot of its themes that went straight over my head that you would probably more easily pick up on if you're a woman. So yeah, I'll put a link to that video in the description if you're interested in watching it, because it really opened my eyes to some of the stuff that I didn't notice. I'm putting Silent Hill 3 in 3rd place in my series ranking, which again is probably a reasonably unpopular opinion, because once again I'm putting it above Silent Hill 2, which from my understanding is regarded as the best one generally. While the story of Silent Hill 2 is better, and I don't really think there's any denying that, I do think that Silent Hill 3 is better in almost every other area. The way the game uses smaller and more linear level design is probably a point of contention, but I liked it and thought the way that this allowed the game to feature more level themes and give it a faster pace makes it stand out from the previous entries. The combat in this game is far better than in the previous games as well, and the enemies actually require different strategies to defeat or get past. So I'm glad that far more focus was put on this element. And the graphics, music and sound design are just as good as ever. While it takes quite a long time to start actually introducing proper puzzles, I found that the puzzles to be far better than anything we saw in Silent Hill 2. And it was much closer to the standards set by the first game in this area. So basically, the combat and puzzles are better in Silent Hill 3 compared to 2, and the exploration is so different that it's not really directly comparable. Going into this, I was hoping that we would see a greater focus put on the open areas in the exterior of Silent Hill, but removing these sections entirely does also work as well. Although I do completely understand why some people probably wouldn't like this decision. What it comes down to is that Silent Hill 1 and 3 are better for their gameplay, whereas Silent Hill 2 is better for its story. And yet, when they adapted this series into films, they chose Silent Hill 1 and 3 as the basis, which really makes no sense at all. And that's Silent Hill 3. Despite it being so different to the two previous entries, with things like its structure and at times even its tone, I actually really liked it. Next time in the Silent Hill Marathon though, we're going to be taking a look at the 4th and the final game released in the series, which was developed by the original creators, with Silent Hill 4, The Room. Really, the only major thing that I'm looking for from this game is more effort being put into making it legitimately scary, because as of now, the 3 main Silent Hill games that we've covered haven't actually been particularly scary, and they've been more so spooky than anything else. Especially with the 3rd game, which I think has been the least scary out of all of them. But until then, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and leave a comment down below letting me know what you think about Silent Hill 3. And until the next video,